The following podcast with Israeli spy Joanthan Pollard went so long because there are so many interesting stories that we broke it into two separate episodes.
So I was arrested. And everybody was actually very relieved to find out I wasn't a Soviet spy. I wasn't a Soviet spy yet.
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Joanthan Pollard, a very unusual man with a fascinating and complex life story. His Wikipedia page fills 28 pages of a Word document, all in small print. And that includes 9 pages of more than 200 notes and references. What also makes him unique is that he is the first felon to be a guest on my show. Joanthan was arrested by the FBI and imprisoned in 1985. And then in 1987, he was convicted of spying for Israel. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, despite having entered into a plea agreement with the government that specified a far less serious penalty. After serving 30 years in prison, followed by 5 years of parole, Joanthan returned to Israel in 2020, where he will soon be joining us on this Zoom call. As you'll learn, his story is not only about espionage, it's also about evil men in our government who abuse power, and his story also contains some anti-Semitism. As I mentioned, Joanthan's life is complex, filled with twists and turns, so I'm going to give you an overview, and then the details will emerge through my discussion with him on Zoom from his home today in Tel Aviv. Joanthan Pollard was born in Texas to a Jewish mother and father. At an early age, he learned that his mother's family were murdered in the Holocaust, and that made him recognize the importance of Israel, which, as you'll see, plays a significant role in his life. After earning a degree in political science at Stanford, Joanthan attended graduate school at Tufts University, but left before earning a degree to accept a job in 1979 with the Navy as an intelligence specialist, where he was given top-secret clearance, which was then later increased to a higher level of clearance called SCI, Clearance for Sensitive Compartmented Information. A few years later, in 1984, while serving as an analyst for the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, Joanthan met a veteran of the Israeli Air Force, Aviam Sella, and told Sella that the U.S. intelligence was withholding crucial information from Israel that it was supposed to provide to Israel under information sharing agreements. And Joanthan offered to provide that information as a spy for Israel. Aviam discussed this with his former superiors, who gave him the go-ahead to work with Joanthan, and shortly afterwards, Joanthan started providing classified information to him, the first of which was information on manufacturing plants in Iraq that were producing chemical weapons. It's been reported that over time, Joanthan passed more than 800 classified publications and more than 1,000 cables to Israeli handler, who copied them and then returned the originals to Joanthan. Joanthan's supervisor became suspicious of his interest and possession of so much classified material, some of which was not even related to his department's responsibilities. His supervisor confronted him and demanded that Joanthan take a polygraph test. But strangely, when confronted, and rather than take the polygraph test, Joanthan admitted to him that he had indeed illegally passed documents to unauthorized individuals. But based on his admissions, the FBI was notified and they started an investigation which included surveillance. Somehow, Joanthan's Israeli handler learned about the investigation and urged Joanthan and his wife to leave the U.S. immediately before they were arrested. But despite that warning, a few days later in November of 1985, Joanthan went to the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. to seek asylum. He was ordered to leave and was immediately arrested by the FBI. He was held in custody in a federal prison, during which time formal charges were being prepared and negotiations with his legal team began. After extensive negotiations in late May of 1986, the U.S. government offered him a plea agreement, which he accepted. By the terms of that agreement, Joanthan agreed to plead guilty to one count of conspiracy to deliver national defense information to a foreign government and to cooperate fully with the government's ongoing investigation. In exchange for his guilty plea, and because Joanthan's actions were to help an ally and not meant to harm the U.S. government, the prosecutor agreed to recommend that Joanthan not be sentenced to life imprisonment, which could have gone with those charges without the plea agreement. However, the judge, Aubrey Robinson Jr., did not follow the terms of the plea agreement. Instead, on March 4, 1987, he imposed a life sentence on Joanthan Pollard. It's assumed that he did so because the judge was highly influenced by a damage assessment memorandum submitted by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, which overstated the seriousnesses of Pollard's crime. In 2015, after 30 years of confinement in various federal prisons, the first 5 of which were in solitary confinement in a supermax security prison, solitary confinement for 5 years, he was finally released. But even then, after 30 years, he was put on parole for an additional 5 years. His parole finally expired in 2020, and he moved to Israel and settled in an apartment in Jerusalem. Joanthan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
That was the longest introduction for any of my guests in the past, but there are still so many avenues to explore with you. First of all, what motivated you to spy for Israel? Was it money, altruism? What was it?
Concern. I was on the Navy team that was responsible for the transfer of information as part of the U.S.-Israel Intelligence Exchange Agreement. And it was very clear from the start that the U.S. was violating both the spirit as well as the letter of that agreement. And Israel, in a word, Israel was being blindsided illegally by an undeclared intelligence embargo that had been ordered by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and the Deputy CIA head, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, both of whom had I would call it a visceral dislike of Israel and Jews in general. So I tried very hard to follow legal means of correcting the situation and was shut down at every turn.
So let me make sure I understand. There was an agreement, a sharing agreement between Israel and the United States, and I'm sure the United States has it with many countries, where it's agreeing to provide confidential, secret information on enemies of that ally in exchange for other information. And you saw specifically that there were cases where the U.S. government, Weinberger and Bobby Inman, whatever, head of the CIA, were specifically not sending important information that should have been sent to Israel.
It was worse than that. There was a lot of information that was just plain wrong. And when I raised a concern about this, one answer I got, for example, was, well, let them lose a few airplanes, and they'll figure out what the correct frequency of certain enemy equipment was. Ooh. And I was, to be honest with you, I was horrified by that kind of.
Well, I didn't know it went to that extent, that they not only didn't provide valuable information, but they provided false information.
Yes, I can give you a specific example.
Yes.
I have to be a little bit vague about the place. I was asked at one point to provide whatever information was available on a specific location in Iraq. This was during the Iran-Iraq War.
And you were asked by whom? You were asked by Israel?
Yes.
Okay.
But there was a reason. I mean, there was an obvious reason, but another secondary reason for that. So I did. And one day I met the Israeli team that had just come from the Pentagon, where they were told that this particular facility didn't exist, that they should just relax, that they had gotten bad information.
For example, it could have been the Osiris reactor that ultimately Israel bombed.
No, it was more of a chemical nature.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so I had on the floor a huge matrix of pictures of the largest type of facility in the world that was producing some pretty bad stuff.
Right.
Some pretty bad stuff. And the team looked at that matrix very sadly. And one of them looked at me and he said, "You see, Joanthan, sometimes it's better to deal with reliable enemies than unreliable friends." And what happened after that was rather tragic. To protect me, the Israelis flew 2 reconnaissance F-4 Phantoms on that plant. They lost one of the planes.
Oh, in other words, they were going to get their own information, knowing that it was there. They had to show the U.S. that they didn't know, and that they then sent planes that got the information.
Right. One of the planes was lost along with its crew, 2-man crew, which it's one of those tragedies. But the pictures that they got were damning. And they confronted the United States with those pictures and were basically told to take a hike. No apology, no remorse, no embarrassment. Just told, take a hike. So that was the kind of duplicity that was existing at the time. Look, Washington at the time was, in terms of the Middle East, consisted of 2 camps. One camp was pro-Egyptian, pro-Saudi, pro-Iraq. And the other was pro-Israel, a much smaller group. And at the time, U.S. policy, especially as set out by Caspar Weinberger, was decidedly pro-Saudi. And that
And
meant
I want to make it clear to the audience that this was a time when Saudi Arabia was a radical country, not the country that it is today.
Yeah, it was radical Sunni,
Islam. Yeah.
Wahhabi.
Yeah.
Very, very, very radical.
Now, who was
But
president
in
at
an
that time,
acceptable way.
Jonathan? Who was president? Was that Carter? Was that under Carter?
I came in during Carter, and I operated mostly under the first and second terms of Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm. But Caspar Weinberger served under Carter, I think.
No.
He didn't. Oh.
No. Just under Reagan.
But Reagan was, I thought, my impression is that Reagan was very pro-Israel.
Reagan was. Mm-hmm. But it didn't necessarily mean that there were individuals within his administration that had a very different view of the U.S.-Israel special relationship.
Understood.
And what complicated things for me when I was caught, and by the way, what I admitted to when I was caught,
confronted, yeah.
And by the way, I was compromised by a CIA spy in the Knesset and Foreign Affairs Committee in Israel. And I found out about that many years later when he sued the CIA for an inadequate retirement package in federal court in New York. And one of the things that he said to buttress his claim for enhanced pension was me, that he had helped expose me. So it kind of brought up the whole hypocrisy issue of even friendly states don't spy on one another. So it was agreed that if I had been caught, I would confess to being a Pakistani spy, which I did. And there were things in my
wait. When you said you did, you confessed to that, or you were a Pakistani spy?
No, I confessed to being a Pakistani spy.
I see.
And there were things in my apartment that would confirm that. Initially, superficially, it would confirm it. Mm-hmm. Plane tickets, fake plane tickets to Islamabad and things like that. Pakistani money, pictures of me with various Pakistani high-ranking officers. And the plan was for me to be exfiltrated, to just disappear, leaving the Pakistanis with, mud on their face, basically.
Good idea.
But things didn't work out that way because my handler, Rafi Eitan, didn't even attempt to save me. Mm-hmm. And I later found out that was his modus operandi. He just abandoned agents as if they were expendable. Mm-hmm. That's all. I didn't know that at the time.
So I thought you were caught because you admitted it to your boss, but there's more to it.
No, there's a lot more to it.
Okay.
That's one of the dangers about Wikipedia. My team used to have a full-time editor that would correct inaccuracies in Wikipedia, mm-hmm. only to have them repeated again the next day. And it got so bad that we finally just said, forget it, just let it go, because there was no way we could keep up with it. It was a full-time job. So when I was arrested at the Israeli embassy, the bulk of the FBI field office was waiting for me at the Pakistani embassy. That's where they thought I was going.
Now, why, is it true that you were notified by your Israeli handler or by somebody that they were on to you, that they saw the surveillance?
What happened was I came in one day and I noticed that my safes, plural, were open. And that's never done. I mean, you have to leave these safes locked and closed. I had cipher locks, multiple cipher locks. So when I brought my concerns to my boss, he just kind of blew it off. Mm-hmm. And that got me very concerned. So that night I came in and something just told me to look in the false ceiling above my office.
Mm-hmm.
Just a hunch. And sure enough, there was a camera, a movie camera, not video. It was an old movie camera pointing straight down at my desk. So at that point, I had two choices. I could run, and I had the ability to, at that moment, disappear. Or I had to stay and obtain some very critical information that was more important than my life.
Joanthan, tell us again, a little bit more detail. You saw a camera in the ceiling. Continue on.
Well, let me just back up a little bit. When I was in Israel for the last time, I expressed my concerns to my control officer, Rafi Eitan, that I felt that somebody was closing in on me. Mm-hmm. And it's not anything in specific that I could have pointed to, but it's just a feeling. When you're in this profession, you're acutely aware of things that are not normal or that are unusual, out of place, for example. And he told me, look, you've already accomplished a lot of what we needed. And if you just go back, there's one more very important piece of information we need. It's a make or break for war. He explained it to me, and I agreed with him that it was that important. The same situation faced Eli Cohen, the famous Israeli spy that was in Damascus for quite a while, was later caught and murdered, hanged. He also felt the enemy closing in and was convinced to go back one last time for equally critical strategic information. In fact, when I got on the airplane to come home, I was conflicted. And I wanted to get off the airplane and just stay in Israel. But I realized how important this information was, so I came back. Now, when I saw the camera, and then I realized the safe was open, I had this choice. I could run and probably get away, or I had to get that information if it were the last thing I did. Complicating this matter was the fact that my first handler, at that point, Colonel Aviam Sella, a war hero, was also in town visiting me, and he didn't have diplomatic immunity. He had just gotten his PhD in computer science from NYU, and he was visiting just to say hello to me. And I had to make a choice here also. His life was more important than mine. You do that in this profession. So it took me a while to safely communicate with him, but it would take me a while because I just assumed that I was being followed. So I finally got the information that was needed. And that's when I was picked up at the office. And they gave me one phone call to my wife, in fact, then wife, who was part of the operation as well. And I gave her a code word, which was basically get out of town. And she knew that she had to alert Colonel Sella to get out as well. So eventually, I confessed to being a Pakistani spy, and I knew what would happen at that point. They would have to start a whole new investigation, which would buy time. for me. And when I called the embassy, a number, and asked, what are my instructions? How are we getting out of here? I was told, come to the embassy. And I was horrified. I said, look, I've already confessed to being a Pakistani spy. Just activate the escape plan, because I'm surrounded by FBI agents here. I can't make a move without them following me. And they said, well, Rafi, my control officer, had canceled all the escape plans for whatever reason. So I had no choice. So I showed up to the embassy, and they thought I was going to the Pakistani embassy. I kind of fooled them. And I managed to, they were waiting for me at the Israeli embassy. They opened up the gate. I drove in, they closed the gate, and I'm there. And then it was just a few minutes more when word came from Jerusalem that I was to be, expelled. And it was pretty shocking. But before I got into the car, the chief of security at the embassy asked me for my last report.
Oh, I see. They're throwing you under the bus, but they still want the last report.
Well, when you're a patriot, it's for the greater good.
I understand.
So I gave them my last report. And it was good that I did. So I was arrested. And everybody was actually very relieved to find out I wasn't a Soviet spy. I wasn't a Soviet spy yet. What happened, there were two things that led to my life sentence. Three things. One, I didn't cooperate by implicating innocent people. I basically don't have any co-conspirators. I took it all myself. The second thing was there were two moles, Soviet agents working in Washington at the time. Aldrich
James.
What's his name? Aldrich James at the CIA, and Robert Hansen at the FBI. And they were both instructed to implicate me as the source of all the leaks to the Soviets.
So as to protect all the other leaks, to protect themselves.
To protect themselves.
Right, I
Correct.
understand. Wow.
I didn't know this at the time. This is why
our viewers may not know that Robert, what was his last name?
Hansen.
Robert Hansen was head of counterintelligence for the FBI.
That was Ames.
Oh, that was Aldrich James was head of counterintelligence?
Right, for the CIA.
For the CIA, okay. But what did Hansen do? Hansen worked for the FBI, didn't he?
Correct. And he handled a lot of the Soviet issues for the CIA, for the FBI.
But he was still, but in reality, he was working for the Soviets.
Correct.
Right.
So what happened, I was later asked by a former prosecutor who came to see me in prison, who felt, I guess the only word is remorse for what happened to me. He said, when the judge asked you, did you have any remorse for the deaths you caused? The former prosecutor asked me, where was your head? And I said it was in Tunis. I was part of the Israeli intelligence group that put together an airstrike that was designed to kill Arafat in Tunis. And we missed. He deviated from his normal patterns, and the jets flew overhead and bombed his headquarters and killed about 90 of his terrorist followers.
But not him.
So when the judge said, do you have any remorse for all the deaths you caused? I said, yes, that there wasn't one more.
Yeah, right.
So the prosecutors, that's when he said, "Where was your head?" So I said, "It was in Tunis."
Mm.
He said, "Well, let me tell you where the judge's head was. It was in the basement of the Lefortovo prison in Moscow, KGB prison, where Ames had described how General Igor Trechikov, aka Tricycle, code name, had been fed feet first alive into a furnace in front of his family. And here you are telling the judge you're just sorry, basically, that you didn't kill one more CIA agent." He said, "Did you notice how many security officers were in the court that day?" And I said, "Yeah, it was like an army of them." He said, "Well, that's because there were a lot of CIA field officers that had volunteered to come in and execute you right in court."
Yeah, but you didn't, as far as I know, none of your information was ever implicated in the death of one of our people, right?
No, I was actually never charged with compromising any agents. I was asked to by my second control officer, Rafi Eitan, who said, "If you don't tell us the names of the American spies that are in Israel, one of them is going to get you." And thank God, I didn't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
I never, and one of them did get me.
Mm-hmm.
But the business with Ames was later cleared up when he was arrested and debriefed. And at that point, Senator Dennis DeConcini of Arizona, who was the chairman then of the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, wrote a bipartisan letter to Bill Clinton saying, "You got the wrong guy. You've wasted years letting the real spy continue to destroy the CIA agent network in the Soviet Union. And so you better let him go. You better let him go." So Clinton basically said, "I'm too valuable as a bargaining tool with the Israelis."
Mm-hmm.
And he admitted at the Y River negotiations, where he had initially agreed to let me go and then reneged because he was convinced that I was too valuable. He wasn't getting enough for me. And everybody sitting around the table, that included the then Attorney General, Secretary of State, everybody, Secretary of Defense, all admitted, Dennis Ross later wrote about this, that I was sentenced way too harshly and that I should go, except for the fact that I was useful. Now, 20 years later, I finally got the real damage assessment, And there were two crimes, so to speak, that I was felt to have committed. One of them was that I angered some of America's Arab Middle East allies because they felt that I had made Israel too strong.
Mm-hmm.
The second reason was that I gave Israel the information they were supposed to have anyway, but I gave them the information without benefit of a quid pro quo for the United States. The fact that the information was being illegally withheld was kind of glossed over.
I see. But perhaps Weinberger's report, which was so damning in the judge's eyes, maybe they did blame you for the American agents who were killed in the Soviet Union. Incorrectly.
Oh, they blamed me. They blamed me for a lot of other things, which they couldn't state openly because they could have been refuted very easily.
I see.
Just a footnote to this, to Weinberger's damning document. Many years later, a noted American Jewish historian, Edward Black, interviewed Weinberger on the occasion of his memoirs being published. And he asked Weinberger, why is it that Joanthan Pollard isn't mentioned in your memoirs at all? And Weinberger, on the record, said, well, the Pollard case was actually a minor matter, made more important than it actually was. Quote, unquote. And then he died. Weinberger died just a few weeks later. Well, when my lawyers went to the Office of Professional Integrity at the Justice Department with this information, they didn't deny it. And they said, well, it's water under the bridge. So here he is admitting he's a perjurer anyway. I mean, he was cleared for perjury in the Iran-Contra affair. And actually, his hatred of me had to do more with the Iran-Contra affair than it did with anything else. Why? I was asked by the Israelis, because I had an unknown face, to go open up all the accounts in Switzerland for the Iran-Contra affair. That is for both the Americans involved and the Israelis, which I did. That's the origin of my Swiss bank account. So later, after I was sentenced, the tax court had a whack at me, and they wanted to know who I opened the accounts up for. They acknowledged that I did not have access to the accounts. I only had permission to open them. So I said I wasn't going to say. And I'll tell you why. The Americans were all patriots. They weren't making money out of this. It wasn't some sordid affair. They were patriots. And while I didn't know them personally, I was on the same team.
Yeah, you didn't want to hurt America. But I'm confused. Why was Israel...
So wait. So what happened? Let me just finish this. So what happened was the judges said, if you don't tell us, we're going to stick you with the money. But I said, it's not mine. He said, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
So as they explained it, I was an exceedingly rich man for about 5 minutes.
Yeah, who didn't pay taxes on his money.
Before the roof caved in. Yeah, before the roof caved in. And that was it. And so to this day, I have not, nor will I ever, compromise the names of the Americans that were involved in that affair. And it's ironic if you think about it. I'm protecting Americans.
Now, go back. I didn't understand why, Joanthan, Israel would have any interest in the Iran-Contra affair.
It was called "The Enemy of My Enemy is My Friend."
Okay.
And there was money to be made. One of the requests that was made of me shortly before I was arrested was to figure out what air defense equipment could be somehow transferred to the Iranians to defend the oil loading facilities at Karg Island. So I was the one that came up with the suggestion to trade old Israeli Hawk missiles through Spain for improved or IHawk missiles that the United States would transfer to Israel, 1-to-1. And that's what was done. That letter, by the way, it was so rushed at the end. I had a new tape in my typewriter, Olivetti typewriter. That's how old it was. And I didn't have, I just had a lapse, and I forgot to destroy the tape, the ribbon. And they reconstructed the letter
from the ribbon
I had written. And that's when all hell broke loose for me. And I had only one card to play. I'm in prison already. I had one card to play. So I said, please inform these people in the White House that I was responsible for the Raptors Hawks that are today being transferred to Iran in Spain. So that night, I was going to be released, or so I thought. And I was almost assassinated that night. If I had walked out in my civilian suit out the back door of the prison to where my lawyers supposedly were, the FBI's hostage rescue team was posted up with instructions to shoot, to kill an armed escapee who was dressed in a khaki Brioni suit. That would have been me. And what had happened was the CIA basically wanted to get me out of the country. And Weinberger wanted me dead. And he won out. But luckily, it was kind of like a sixth sense. I ran and hid for a day in the prison until I was hungry and I just surrendered and was put back in my cell.
Well, luckily they didn't do a Jeffrey Epstein on you.
No, they didn't. I was later, much later, when another trial was taking place of certain members of the American team during the Iran-Contra team. This was later. I was visited by one of their lawyers, and I had my lawyer with me. And he gave me a newspaper from Monterrey, Mexico. I don't read Spanish. So I said, I don't read Spanish. What do you want me to see here? And he said, well, look at the picture. And it was a twin-engine Comanche that was burned to a crisp with the guy, burned in the pilot's seat. And they said, he said to me, do you know who that is? And I said, how would I know? No. He said, that's your friend. And he mentioned the guy's name. He was coming back to testify against my client and several other clients. And he had an unfortunate accident. His plane burst into flames. He said, how is your memory? I said, pretty bad. I don't recollect anything. He said, well, you better keep it that way, because he said, I know you walk the track every day. And he said, the last thing you might see is a glint of light in the tree line. You get my point. And I said, completely. And to this day, I've never talked about any of the details involved with my activity. One of the things that the prosecutor that visited me later wrote about openly in the Miami Herald was the fact that there was a dirty ship that sailed out of Belgium, Ostend. And one of my tasks was to keep an eye on dirty ships, that is, ships that were carrying weapons to terrorist groups targeting Israel, like the PLO. This ship was supposed to be going to Yemen, where the PLO was at the time. And it was loaded, I thought, with small arms. So I reported this to Israel, and the ship, when it docked in Greece, in Thessaloniki, was raided by Interpol and the Greek police. And wow, there was over $10 million worth of high-tech NATO armament on board. This was not small arms going to the PLO in Yemen. What I later found out from the prosecutor was that the shipment had been put together by George Herbert Walker Bush as vice president, as the first Iran-Contra shipment. And it was actually bound for Iran. So the vice president's lawyers came to see me, according to the story, and they asked me, what do you know about the ship? Well, I thought characteristics of the ship, length, breadth, depth, cargo capacity, whatever. And I said, I know everything. I didn't know that it was the vice president's operation.
Mm-hmm.
So I became a threat to the vice president's, the possibility of the vice president becoming president after Reagan left,
Mm-hmm.
after his second term.
So I had no idea, and in the research that I've done, which was a few hours but not days, there was no mention of your involvement at all or the risk of the Iran-Contra to your
to this day, the existence of that letter is acknowledged by the FBI, but they absolutely will not get off the letter, and there have been congressional and Senate subpoenas for that letter, and they won't get off it because it shows, unfortunately, in great detail to what extent the United States was involved in an illegal act at the time. Because what they did, the Iran-Contra operation, was totally illegal. And so
my memory is not quite clear on it, but it had to do with the colonel whose name escapes me, who was
Oliver North.
Oliver North, right? And there's a movie about the Iran-Contra. So give us a little background, because I'm foggy on it.
What happened was there was a war in Central America against the Sandinistas that had taken over, communists that had taken over Nicaragua.
Yes.
The Contras were a guerrilla group that the United States and some South American countries, which were under juntas at the time, military regimes, were backing. And they had a guerrilla war, basically, against the Sandinistas.
And we were backing the Contras secretly.
The problem was that there was a congressional law passed forbidding the United States from funding the Contras.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead. It's coming.
And so, in order to fund them, this idea came up of selling equipment to the Iranians at inflated prices and taking the profit and giving it to the Contras.
Mm-hmm. So obviously the administration didn't want this known, because that was breaking the law, because the law was that Congress forbid.
Totally.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
Totally.
Okay.
There was no way you could justify it.
Right. So somehow they involved you to help.
I was recruited by the Israeli team because I had access to certain information. And I was very experienced in certain things in Europe, mostly banking things. And so I did it, and successfully. And I mean, there were some funny moments when I came to this young banker in this beautiful villa in Zurich. And he looked at me and he said, you are? And I had 4 passports on me at the time. And I'd been on the road for about, 72 hours straight. And I was almost hallucinating. I was being cleaned to make sure I wasn't followed. So I looked at him and I just said, oh, to hell with it. And I brought out all 4 passports. And I couldn't remember which one I was supposed to be. So he said, could I help you? And I said, please. And so he picked the right passport. And he said, you are so-and-so? And I said, yes. He said, fine, let's proceed. So it was.
That's a riot.
There
Well,
are funny
that was
moments.
sort of common in Switzerland, I think, where secret banking was the way of doing business.
Look, when I walked down the street, this very nice street, there were so many guys sitting at cafes with an open newspaper, obviously not reading the newspaper. I pulled my hat down and, okay. And when I went into the bank, my wife, who was watching my back, said that everybody put their newspapers down and were writing something. It was all being filmed.
But I'm confused. How does opening a bank account in Switzerland help you determine other money laundering by the U.S. or others? How did that help?
The money that was put in this account, both by the Americans and by the Israelis, was to be used during the course of the operation.
I see.
For
by
travel
their agents,
purposes.
by their agents around the world. I
Yes.
see. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
For example, Bud McFarlane, the national security advisor to President Reagan, who was a great man, a very great patriot. He flew into Iran, for God's sake, and he flew up many other places. So it was kind of a logistical thing where this money had to be available for
I
that.
see. I understand.
And so,
okay, I get it. Now, of all the things you've done, it sounds like that was the most dangerous, or that you didn't know was dangerous, but that everybody wanted to keep totally secret to the extent that they would even consider killing you. Do you think you're still being watched today?
Everybody, the short answer is yes. I already had an incident here in Jerusalem, which I was waiting for. It happened outside a hotel after I had given a speech to a group of lawyers, and we were standing outside just talking. And a guy came walking over to me. I saw him out of the side of my head, and he had a military bearing. He was dressed in paramilitary clothes. Big guy, fit.
Intimidating.
And he just, very intimidating. And he came up to me and he said, I hate you. And okay, why? He said, the story he told me was to everybody, you cost me my job. So I looked at him and I said, what, you lost your job as a dancer in a gay bar? Is that what happened? So, he took a couple of steps towards me, and I always carry a commando knife, so I pulled it out and held it behind me. And I was just looking at this guy, trying to figure out, where do I hit him? The throat, thorax, kidney, because I realized if he got his hands on me, I'm dead. So luckily, I know a lot of the security guys in the hotels. There's several hotels in the area, and they came out of the woodwork armed. And I had a shadow at the time, a local security guy that was a shadow. And he didn't back off. So they put him down, and they found a gun on him. And
this was all in Israel, right? This is all in Israel.
Yeah. You better call this number. And it was the embassy. And they came, and they got him out of the country. He was official. So was it a hit? Probably. If anything happens to me, it's the Americans. The Arabs, they don't, it's not a problem. I mean, there's so many people just getting randomly killed, it doesn't make any difference. But the Americans still have a problem with me because I never talked.
Thank you for tuning in to part 1 of the 2-part podcast with Joanthan Pollard. Stay tuned for the second part next week.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate reading your comments on YouTube and social media, and now you can submit your questions on my website as well. Head over to lifelessonswithdrbob.com and click the question tab at the top of the page or the one on the right side of the screen, and let us know what's on your mind. I'll answer your questions at the beginning of each episode, so let it rip. Let's have some fun.